Frances Blackshire sat alone at a dimly lit table in Aurelio's, Manhattan's exclusive Italian restaurant, her phone showing 8:47 p.m., 47 minutes late. Her date had once again stood her up, and the familiar sting of rejection gnawed at her. She was tired of pretending to be someone else, tired of men who couldn't see past her intellect. She reached for her coat, ready to escape the disappointment. But before she could leave, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Are you eating alone too?" Frances looked up to see a little girl, no older than 8, standing at her table. The girl wore an elaborate pink princess dress, a rhinestone tiara perched on her head. Her serious brown eyes met Frances's, far too old for her youthful face. "Yes," Frances replied, still trying to process the interruption. The child, undeterred, asked with startling boldness, "Can you be my mom? Papa says I need one. All his dates are boring. You look sad like me." Sad people understand each other. Frances blinked, taken aback by the question, but before she could respond, a deep voice cut through the room. "Veronica, what did I tell you about approaching strangers?" Frances turned to see him, a tall man, his sharp features framed by dark, swept-back hair, dressed in a crisp white shirt that clung to his broad shoulders. Tattoos snaked up his neck and arms, visible even under the cuff of his rolled sleeves. He looked dangerous and impossibly handsome, the kind of man whose presence demanded attention. "My daughter has a habit of adopting strays," the man said, his Italian accent rich and commanding. "I apologize for the intrusion." Before he could usher Veronica away, Frances found herself speaking up, her words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Wait." Antonio de Legnago, as he introduced himself, studied her for a long moment, intrigued by her lack of hesitation, her ability to meet his gaze without fear. Veronica's hopeful eyes seemed to pull Frances in, and despite herself, she found she couldn't say no. "Would you join us for dinner, Miss Blackshire?" Antonio asked, his gaze never leaving hers. For the first time in years, Frances felt like someone had seen her for who she truly was, not just the woman with the doctoral degree, but the woman who had been standing alone. So, she accepted their invitation. Over Italian wine and Veronica's endless questions about Renaissance art, the evening took an unexpected turn. Antonio, rather than dismissing her expertise as most people did, seemed genuinely interested. And as the dinner unfolded, he made an unusual proposition. "I need you to authenticate a Caravaggio I've acquired. I'll offer an extraordinary fee, with a 1-month deadline." Something in his dark eyes told her there was more at stake than just a painting. Frances was suspicious, but Veronica's tiny hand was still nestled in hers under the table, and Antonio was looking at her like she was a puzzle worth solving. And for the first time in years, Frances felt chosen. Frances stared at the empty chair across from her, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Another blind date that hadn't shown, another failure to prove she wasn't too much. Her sister's advice echoed in her mind. Try harder, smile more. As if her PhD and professional success were things to apologize for. She wasn't the kind of woman men wanted, not for long anyway. She could feel the weight of the evening's isolation pressing in as she looked around at the couples sharing quiet conversations, the golden glow of the restaurant's Christmas lights bouncing off crystal glasses and polished silverware. She sighed, reaching for her coat, already imagining how her sister would lecture her later. But before she could stand, a voice cut through her thoughts. "Are you eating alone too?" Frances looked up to find a little girl standing at the edge of her table, dressed in a sparkling pink princess dress, complete with a rhinestone tiara. Her serious brown eyes studied Frances with a directness that almost unsettled her. Yes, I suppose I am," Frances managed, surprised by the question. The child tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "Can you be my mom?" she asked simply. "Papa says I need one. All his dates are boring. You look sad like me. Sad people understand each other." Frances blinked, her heart stuttering in her chest. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The vulnerability in the child's words seemed too heavy for such a young voice. But before Frances could process, a deep voice interrupted from behind her. "Veronica, what did I tell you about approaching strangers?" Frances turned, her breath catching as she saw him. He was tall, powerfully built, wearing a crisp white shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. His dark hair was swept back, and tattoos crawled up his neck, visible even beneath the rolled sleeves of his shirt. There was something dangerous about him, something that commanded respect without a word. His presence filled the space, making the restaurant feel smaller. He placed a protective hand on Veronica's shoulder, his eyes scanning Frances with a quiet intensity. "My daughter has a habit of adopting strays," he said with an accent that made even casual words sound intimate. "I apologize for the intrusion." Frances swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She didn't want to be caught staring, but the man was impossible to ignore. And yet, as she opened her mouth to respond, she surprised herself. "Wait," she said before she could stop herself. Antonio de Legnago, as he introduced himself, gave her an unreadable look before turning to Veronica. "Would you join us for dinner, Miss Blackshire?" he asked, his dark eyes never leaving hers. Something in his gaze softened. Or perhaps it was the vulnerability in Veronica's question that made Frances take the leap. "Yes," she heard herself say, surprising even her. Dinner unfolded easily, unexpectedly so. Veronica peppered her with questions about art restoration, fascinated by Frances's journal and the world of Renaissance paintings. Antonio observed their conversation in silence, his intensity palpable but unthreatening. Eventually, he made his proposition. "I need someone with both expertise and discretion. I recently acquired a painting, possibly a Caravaggio, that requires authentication. I need you to assess it independently and on a 1-month deadline." Frances considered it. The fee was extraordinary, more than enough to pay off her lingering student loans. Yet there was an unspoken weight in his eyes that told her there was far more to this than a simple art restoration job. By dessert, she was negotiating terms: full access to the painting, no interference, and full independence in her analysis. Antonio agreed with a subtle nod. But then came the unexpected condition. "Work from my home," he said, his voice steady. "Veronica needs consistency, not another person who comes and goes." As they left the restaurant, Veronica hugged her fiercely, her arms small but insistent. "You'll come tomorrow? You promise?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. Frances found herself promising, without fully thinking it through. But there was something in the girl's eyes, something that made her feel like she was needed in a way she hadn't in a long time. For the first time in ages, Frances felt like she wasn't invisible. And for the first time in a long while, she had the unexpected feeling that perhaps, just maybe, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The next morning, Frances arrived at Antonio's Tribeca penthouse expecting a sleek gallery space, a place where art would be displayed for scholarly discussion. But the reality was nothing like she imagined. She was greeted by the cold hum of high-tech security, a biometric lock on the door, cameras at every corner, and bulletproof glass that overlooked the Hudson River like a fortress. It felt more like a bunker than a home. As she stepped inside, the modern security systems clashed with the Renaissance elegance of the space. Caravaggio paintings hung alongside panic buttons, and marble floors gleamed underfoot, but beneath them, she could feel the weight of reinforced steel, solid and unyielding. This was a place where both beauty and danger coexisted. A tall, scarred man in a dark suit appeared to guide her through the building. Javier, Antonio's head of security, moved with military precision. His silence was heavy, each gesture calculated. Frances noticed everything: the hidden escape routes, the surveillance blind spots, the subtle communication between guards. Her architectural training kicked in, and she saw the building not just as a space, but as a strategy, every inch designed for defense and control. They passed through a spacious hallway, and Javier led her to the kitchen, where Veronica was waiting, already dressed for school. The little girl was bubbly as usual, showing Frances her room before the bus arrived. Her bedroom was every bit as grand as the rest of the penthouse, a princess theme with a canopy bed, a toy castle, and an assortment of art supplies. But as Frances stepped inside, She noticed the reinforced windows and the panic button cleverly disguised as a light switch by the door. The door itself had a lock on the inside, an unsettling sign that safety was paramount in this world. Antonio arrived shortly after, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his posture stiff and businesslike. He was already preparing for another meeting, but he took a moment to show Frances the centerpiece of his collection, the Caravaggio hanging in a climate-controlled room. Judith beheading Holofernes. The painting's intensity hit her the moment she entered. The violence of the scene was illuminated with masterful chiaroscuro, the sharp contrast of light and dark capturing the moment in brutal intimacy. She couldn't help but speak of the anatomical precision, the revolutionary way Caravaggio painted violence as something personal, not heroic. But as she examined the painting further, Frances noticed anomalies. The pigments were correct, and the canvas appeared authentic, but the provenance stopped abruptly in 1945. Antonio's admission came quietly. This piece had been in his family's collection for decades, acquired by his grandfather during World War II. He was trying to establish legitimate ownership to distance himself from his family's criminal past, but the past had its hold on him. Then Frances discovered the most intriguing detail: barely visible text along the edges of the painting, an ancient script that didn't seem to belong. It was 17th century Italian, and it certainly wasn't part of Caravaggio's usual work. She took a photo but said nothing, her mind racing with questions. As evening approached, Antonio returned from meetings, his shirt cuffs stained with blood. He changed quickly, brushing off Frances's questioning glance, and moved to help Veronica with her math homework. His tenderness toward his daughter struck Frances. He was gentle, patient, a loving father in the midst of this intimidating world. When they finally spoke in private, Antonio's voice dropped. "My grandfather was not a good man," he said. "He took things that didn't belong to him. I'm trying to return what can be returned, legitimize what can be legitimized, for Veronica, so she inherits something clean." Frances hesitated before asking the question she'd been avoiding. "What exactly was your grandfather's business?" Antonio's gaze met hers, his eyes steady, unwavering. "The same as mine used to be," he replied. "Moving valuable things that couldn't move legally. Sometimes art. Sometimes other merchandise. I stopped the other merchandise 5 years ago. I'm stopping all of it now." Frances saw the contradiction. The man trying to escape his past while surrounded by the infrastructure of that same past. She saw his genuine love for Veronica, how he cared for her, how he protected her. But she also saw the ruthlessness that lay beneath, a coldness reserved for everyone but his daughter. Antonio was a man in the process of change, and he was beginning to trust her with that truth. And Veronica? She was already attaching herself to Frances in ways that were unexpected. The girl wanted her to stay, to be present. And Frances realized that she hadn't felt this needed in years. Maybe, just maybe, this family could become hers too. 2 weeks had passed since Frances first stepped into Antonio's world, and with each day, her role in it had become more defined. Mornings were spent with Veronica before school, playing art games, teaching her about chiaroscuro and how light and shadow could tell stories. Afternoons were filled with the meticulous work of analyzing the Caravaggio, carefully testing pigments and studying every brushstroke. The evenings, however, were the most unexpected. They sat together for dinner, the three of them, a strange and unlikely family. Antonio would return from his business meetings, and while his focus was still divided between the legitimate world he was building and the shadowy past he was trying to leave behind, something in his eyes softened when he looked at his daughter, and sometimes when he looked at Frances. But there was a gnawing unease that had settled in Frances's chest, one that had nothing to do with the soft, glowing light of their family dinners. The UV-readable text she had found on the edges of the Caravaggio was troubling her. It was no longer a simple curiosity, it was a secret, a dangerous one. She had spent every spare moment translating the script, and what she had uncovered was far worse than she had imagined. The markings weren't provenance. They weren't just notes on ownership, they were coordinates. Locations across Europe: Venice, Zurich, Vienna, Prague. Each location was tied to cryptic references to collections, holdings, and secured assets. The painting, it seemed, wasn't just a masterpiece. It was a map, one to hidden treasures, secret hoards of art, cash, gold, and more. Assets stolen by Antonio's grandfather during the war and hidden away in places no one was meant to find. Frances couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery would change everything. So one evening, she confronted Antonio. She didn't mince words, showing him the translations and the implications. His face went cold as he studied the papers in her hands. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said quietly, his voice edged with something darker. Frances stood her ground, not intimidated by the man who had looked at her like a puzzle worth solving. "I'm an art conservator. Finding hidden things is literally my profession. What did your grandfather hide?" Antonio's silence stretched between them before he finally spoke, the words heavy. "My grandfather worked with organized crime families during the war. He helped them hide assets, art, cash, gold, blackmail materials, things that couldn't be moved legally. The Caravaggio, it holds the key to those locations. And now Vasily Ignatiev, my former partner, wants it. He plans to use it to reclaim what we've tried to leave behind." The weight of his confession sank in, but the real chill came when Antonio added, "Vasily sees me as a traitor. He wants the Caravaggio to rebuild his empire, and he will do anything to get it." That night, the danger became tangible. Javier intercepted Vasily at Veronica's school during pickup. The message was clear. Antonio's past was reaching into their present, threatening what they had begun to build. Antonio, face grim, told Frances she should leave. "Vasily will use anyone close to me as leverage. You've become visible now. You're not safe." Frances, for the first time, was resolute. "I'm not leaving Veronica. Or you. I've spent my career being dismissed, underestimated. For once, someone values my expertise and actually listens when I speak. I'm not walking away from that." Antonio's gaze sharpened, studying her in a way he hadn't before. "Most people run from danger. You run toward it. Why?" Frances met his gaze, her voice steady. "Because running away is lonely. And I'm tired of being alone." The shift between them was palpable, and as she continued to explain her findings in the conservation room later that night, Antonio stood too close, his presence overwhelming. He cupped her face gently, his voice low. "You should be afraid of me." She leaned into his touch, feeling the weight of his words. "I've studied Caravaggio's use of shadow for 10 years. Darkness doesn't scare me when there's light worth protecting." Their kiss was sudden, unexpected. Surrounded by Renaissance masterpieces, it was as if everything, every unspoken word, every guarded emotion, finally clicked into place. But Veronica's small voice interrupted them, her innocent question catching them off guard. "Are you leaving like Mama did?" When things got scary, Frances knelt to her level, her heart aching. "I'm not leaving. Not when things get scary. Not when things get hard. I promise." Veronica searched her face, the fragility of her trust hanging in the balance. "Mama promised too." Frances squeezed her hand, her voice firm. "Then I'll prove I'm different. Every day, until you believe it." In that moment, Frances realized something had shifted. She wasn't just a scholar or an outsider. She was becoming part of something real, something she wasn't ready to walk away from. Not now, not ever. The night of the gallery opening arrived, and Frances couldn't help but feel a strange mix of pride and trepidation. Antonio had insisted she wear the emerald cocktail dress, the one he had given her after their first dinner together. He'd remembered the earrings she wore that night, and the dress was a perfect match. Veronica, ever the planner, had insisted on coordinating. She wore a matching emerald headband, a tiny but determined gesture to solidify their real family look. As they entered the gallery, Frances immediately felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another art event. It was Antonio's first major public performance as a legitimate art dealer. He'd chosen to showcase some of the recently authenticated Renaissance pieces, some of which were Frances's preliminary findings. The room was filled with critics, collectors, and those who had dismissed her work in the past. She could feel their eyes on her as she prepared to speak. As Frances presented her authentication methodology, confidently detailing the science and expertise behind her findings, the room grew quieter. The critics who had once dismissed her now listened with rapt attention. Antonio, standing to the side, observed her with an intensity that was both proud and approving, but there was no possessiveness in his gaze. He was showcasing her as an equal, letting her take the lead in a world where men like him were expected to dominate. The evening took a sharp turn when Vasily Ignatiev arrived, cutting through the crowd with his cold, calculating smile. Dressed in an expensive suit, he oozed predatory charm. His eyes flicked over Frances and Veronica before he turned to Antonio. "Congratulations on your charming new additions to your life, Antonio," he said, his words laced with something venomous. "I remember when you understood that business and family don't mix. Family makes you weak. Sentimental." Before Antonio could respond, Frances stepped in, her voice sharp and clear. "Sentimentality is weakness. Love is strategy. Understanding what you're willing to protect makes you formidable, not vulnerable." Vasily's smile only sharpened. An art historian with opinions. How refreshing. He turned to Frances, his gaze calculating. "Tell me, Miss Blackshire, has Antonio shown you his grandfather's full collection? Or just the pieces with clean provenance?" The tension between them crackled, but the moment was interrupted when Veronica wandered off, captivated by the gallery's storage area where unframed paintings leaned against the walls. Frances's heart skipped a beat, and she immediately set off to find her. Panic gripped her as she searched the dimly lit back rooms, but then she spotted Veronica, standing in front of a large canvas, mesmerized by the art. Relief flooded Frances's chest as she wrapped her arms around the little girl. Antonio arrived moments later, his face tight with concern, his usual composure shattered. Vasily appeared behind them, his voice chilling. Children are so unpredictable. Easy to lose track of them in crowded spaces. Later that evening, Antonio pulled Frances aside, his expression darker than before. "He was showing me he can reach Veronica anytime. That my security isn't enough." Frances took a deep breath. "Then we don't rely only on security. We rely on intelligence. Vasily wants the Caravaggio because it represents power, criminal assets, leverage, the old empire. What if we use that? Make him believe he can take it, then trap him with his own greed." Antonio looked at her, skeptical. "You're suggesting we bait a dangerous man with my daughter's safety as collateral?" Frances met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm suggesting we stop reacting and start controlling the narrative. I'm an expert in authentication, including identifying forgeries. Trust my expertise." Antonio's eyes lingered on her, a shift happening between them. He was seeing her not just as a partner, but as a tactical equal. As the evening wore on, Frances felt the unspoken bond between them deepen. The fear of losing Veronica had solidified their connection. They were no longer just allies. They were co-parents in this dangerous game they were playing, and Frances was determined to protect their future, no matter the cost. The morning after the gallery opening, Frances sat at the large oak table in Antonio's penthouse, her eyes fixed on the final documents she had prepared. The Caravaggio was, without a doubt, authentic. Every test, every analysis confirmed what she had suspected. The painting was worth at least $80 million, and the UV markings, 47 locations across Europe, had been fully decoded. Antonio's grandfather had hidden assets in these places, treasures beyond imagination. Frances had worked tirelessly, piecing together not only the authentication of the masterpiece, but also the legacy of crime tied to it. But just as she was about to present her findings to Antonio, everything unraveled. The phone rang, shattering the tense stillness of the room. Javier, Antonio's head of security, was on the line. Veronica was missing. She had been taken from her private school during lunch recess. Surveillance footage showed a substitute teacher leading her away. It didn't take long for Javier to figure out the truth. Someone on the inside had orchestrated the abduction. Vasily Ignatiev had made his move. Frances felt a chill run through her as Antonio's voice, normally so composed, cracked with fury. He was pacing the room, phone pressed to his ear, barking orders at his security team. The ransom message arrived soon after. A video of Veronica, unharmed but clearly frightened, appeared on the screen. Vasily's cold voice echoed through the room. The painting for the girl. You have 48 hours. No FBI, no police, no dramatic rescues. Just bring the Caravaggio to Venice. I'll send coordinates. Try anything clever, and she disappears the way your grandfather made inconvenient things disappear. Antonio froze. For a moment, Francis saw the mask of the ruthless man who had built an empire. The anger that had simmered beneath his surface broke free. He tore into his security team, threats of violence filling the room, promising to unleash his remaining criminal contacts across 3 continents if needed. He was ready to tear the world apart to get his daughter back. Francis, feeling the weight of his pain, stepped forward. Rage won't bring her home. Strategy will. Think, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. FBI agent Sterling Lopez arrived soon after, her presence a cold reminder of the stakes. She demanded Antonio's cooperation, urging him to let the FBI handle the hostage negotiation. She had the resources to bring Vasily down, to use Veronica as leverage to dismantle his entire operation. Antonio shook his head. I won't risk Veronica becoming collateral damage in your operation, he spat, his voice low and dangerous. That's when Francis made the confession she had been dreading. I found something during authentication I didn't tell you. The Caravaggio has a twin, a forgery created in the 1950s. I discovered documents in Italian archives. The forger was good enough to fool most experts. What if the twin still exists? Antonio, shaken by her words, listened as she explained her plan. They would find the forgery, authenticate it publicly, and make Vasily believe it was the original. In exchange for Veronica's safe return, Francis would falsify the documentation, jeopardizing her career for the chance to save a child. Antonio was horrified. I won't let you sacrifice your reputation for us. But Francis wasn't backing down. Reputation means nothing if Veronica dies. She asked me to be her mom. Mothers protect their children, whatever the cost. Let me do this. The look in Antonio's eyes softened, but the weight of the decision hung heavily between them. He understood, finally, the depth of her commitment. And though he still hesitated, he knew she was right. Family came first. Francis was no longer just a scholar. She was a mother, willing to sacrifice everything to protect what she had come to love. Venice loomed outside the window of the car, the city's Gothic architecture bathed in the dim glow of twilight. Antonio and Francis sat in tense silence, the forged Caravaggio between them, hidden in a custom case designed to look professionally authentic. It was a piece of art that represented their desperate gambit, their last chance to save Veronica, to make everything right, or fail utterly. Francis had spent the last few hours steeling herself for the inevitable confrontation. Vasily would be waiting for them at the Palazzo Contarini del Bovolo, a place of grandeur and labyrinthine hallways that Francis knew intimately. It had been the subject of her dissertation, its architectural complexity a thing of beauty, and now, a maze that might save or doom them. They arrived at the palazzo, stepping out into the cold air. Vasily was already there, his icy presence unmistakable. Veronica stood beside him, her pale face pinched with fear. She clutched the stuffed rabbit Francis had given her weeks ago, a symbol of the bond they'd shared, fragile but real. Francis's heart tightened at the sight, but she pushed the emotion down. They couldn't afford to falter now. Vasily greeted them with a smile that was anything but friendly. I see you've brought the painting. I trust you've also brought your expert. His gaze shifted to Francis, assessing her as if she were already a tool in his hands. Beside him stood an older man, a former museum curator, who would be the one to verify the painting's authenticity. The tension in the room was palpable as Francis set the crate down. Vasily's expert immediately began his examination, asking questions about pigment composition, canvas age, brushstroke technique. Francis answered each one with calm precision, pulling from her extensive knowledge, praying her bluff would hold. Her hands were steady, but her mind was racing. What if the expert had more advanced tools? What if something slipped past her? The minutes dragged, each second a lifetime. Finally, the expert stepped back, nodding. Genuine Caravaggio, no question. The provenance documentation is comprehensive. A wave of relief washed over Francis, but the moment was fleeting. Vasilis' men moved to take the crate, and Antonio stepped forward, reaching for Veronica. But then Vasilis' true plan was revealed. "You really thought I'd just let you walk away?" Vasilis sneered, his eyes cold. "You humiliated me, Antonio. Made me look weak to the families. I'm keeping the girl. Insurance that you won't try to recover the painting or the assets. You can have her back when I'm safely beyond your reach." Maybe. The room exploded into chaos. Gunfire rang out as Vasilis' men provided cover for him to make his escape, Veronica in tow. Antonio's fury ignited, but Francis, her mind working fast, darted toward the hidden passages she knew so well. She moved through the palazzo's maze with the precision of a seasoned navigator, using the secret staircases and servant tunnels she had studied years before. She found them on the famous spiral staircase, Vasily climbing, Veronica clutched tightly in his arms. Antonio's security team was closing in from below, but Vasily had the high ground. Francis's heart raced, but she didn't hesitate. "Vasily," she called, stepping into his line of sight. "You see yourself as a sophisticated criminal, not a thug. You collect art because you appreciate beauty, right? Harming a child isn't sophisticated. It's what desperate men do when they've already lost. You're better than that." For the briefest moment, Vasily hesitated, just enough for Javier to take the shot from across the courtyard. Vasily crumpled, and Veronica was pulled to safety. As Francis reached the trembling girl, Veronica whispered, "I knew you'd come. You promised." Francis held her tightly, the weight of everything they had sacrificed finally crashing down. Antonio stood behind them, his gaze filled with something new, recognition. Not of her as a partner, but as someone who had fought just as fiercely for their family as he would have. In that moment, everything had changed. The days after Vasilis' arrest passed in a blur of paperwork, interviews, and evaluations. Veronica's nightmares were the worst of it. She would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, calling out for her father and for Francis, asking if the scary part was over yet. Each time, Francis stayed by her side, soothing her with soft words and promises that no one would ever take her away again. "I'm not leaving. Not now, not when you're better, not when things get hard again. Never. You're stuck with me." Francis held Veronica close, feeling the weight of her own promises as much as the child's fear. She could only hope the little girl would come to believe that love wasn't conditional, that family was something built by choice, not circumstance. She couldn't fix everything, but she could offer a constant presence, one that wouldn't disappear, even when life was messy. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings rolled on, and Antonio cooperated fully with the FBI. His involvement with Vasilis' criminal network and his grandfather's hidden assets was no longer a secret. With full transparency about his past, he received immunity from prosecution. It was a necessary trade, one that allowed him to step fully into the light, even though it meant confronting every dark corner of his family's history. In return for his cooperation, $300 million in hidden assets were recovered and returned to the rightful victims, families who had lost everything, governments who had been wronged. For Francis, the reckoning came in the form of a call from the Metropolitan Museum's Ethics Board. The leak about the falsified documentation for the Caravaggio had made its way into the public eye, and she knew this day would come. She walked into the boardroom, head held high, prepared to admit everything. When asked about the forgery, she confessed the truth. She had falsified the painting's authentication, but her research on the real Caravaggio was unassailable. The board deliberated, some members visibly appalled, others sympathetic. The director intervened before the decision could go any further. Dr. Blackshire saved a child's life using her expertise. She then provided groundbreaking research on one of the most significant Caravaggio discoveries in decades. "I'm recommending we offer her position as head of Renaissance conservation." It was a moment of redemption, a moment that felt less like victory and more like a shift, like finally integrating the parts of herself that had once been at odds. Antonio, too, was changing. He had no interest in returning to the shadows of his family's past, but he was ready to atone. His proposal was simple but profound. They would create a nonprofit dedicated to repatriating stolen art and using recovered criminal assets to fund victim restitution. The Blackshire Legnago Foundation would be built on the principles of justice and redemption. Antonio turned to Francis. "Help me protect what matters, giving back what my family took, building something Veronica can inherit with pride." Francis nodded. It wasn't just a project, it was a legacy, a way of shaping a future they could all claim as their own. As adoption proceedings began, the paperwork seemed a formality, a confirmation of what everyone already knew. This family was real. Not because of blood, but because they chose each other. When Frances stood in her conservation lab one evening, Antonio handed her a set of property documents for a villa in Tuscany. "I bought this for us," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Away from New York. Away from the past. Where Veronica can grow up without security teams and you can have your conservation lab with proper northern light. Where we can build something clean." Frances kissed him, a smile curving her lips. "We already built something clean. Each other." The opening ceremony of the Blackshire Legnago Foundation was a grand occasion, the culmination of a year's work, and Frances stood before the gathered crowd in the restored Renaissance building, her heart thudding with a mix of pride and humility. The building itself, its marble columns and vaulted ceilings a testament to the city's storied history, was a perfect home for the foundation. It was a place where art would no longer just be a commodity, but a conduit for restitution and transformation. At the center of the room, bathed in soft lighting, hung Judith beheading Holofernes, the Caravaggio that had once been hidden in the shadows of crime, but was now a symbol of redemption. For the first time in 80 years, the painting was displayed publicly, its powerful imagery of light emerging from darkness serving as the perfect metaphor for the foundation itself. It was a reminder that even the most tragic legacies could be reimagined. Frances's voice echoed through the room as she began her speech. Caravaggio mastered chiaroscuro, the art of light emerging from darkness. His genius was understanding that you can't have one without the other. This foundation embraces that truth. We acknowledge the darkness, my family's history of theft, violence, criminality. But we choose light, restitution, justice, transformation. Not by erasing the past, but by making amends for it. As the words left her lips, Frances felt the weight of them. She had lived in that darkness for so long, but here, today, they were building something from it. The foundation wasn't just about recovering stolen art. It was about healing, about giving back to the people whose lives had been shattered by the greed of the past. When the painting was unveiled, its haunting beauty filled the space. Judith's face was illuminated by a flash of light, her expression a fierce mixture of grief and resolve. Frances gazed at the masterpiece, her mind tracing its complex duality. "This masterpiece," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "was both stolen and hidden, both beautiful and dangerous, both legacy and map to justice. Like families, we inherit darkness we didn't create, but we choose what light we build from it." As the crowd murmured in appreciation, survivors and descendants of the original owners approached the recovered artworks. An elderly woman recognized a portrait of her grandmother, lost when her family fled Vienna in 1939. A man found proof of his family's stolen business. A child saw artifacts from their cultural heritage, and Frances realized that the true meaning of restitution wasn't monetary value. It was the return of identity, the restoration of dignity. Veronica stood beside her, waiting for her turn to speak. She had insisted on addressing the crowd, and when she did, her words were simple but profound. "My papa's family took beautiful things that didn't belong to them. Papa, and for giving them back. You can't change bad things that already happened, but you can make better things happen now. That's what families do. We make better things together." Antonio, watching his daughter with pride, turned to Francis, his expression softening. With a quiet gesture, he handed her a small framed deed. It was for a villa in Tuscany, surrounded by olive groves, a place where they could build a life free from the past, a place where Veronica could grow up without the threat of danger. Along with the deed, he gave her a small Renaissance painting, a detailed study of two hands reaching toward each other. "I'm asking you to build a life with me," Antonio said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not because we need to perform family for authorities or because danger forced us together, but because you're the only person I want to build with. Authentically, without performance. Where Veronica can grow up knowing her family chose each other courageously." Francis took the painting, her eyes meeting his. "A year ago, I was sitting alone in a restaurant, convinced I was too much for anyone to choose. Then a brave little girl asked me an impossible question, and her father gave me the space to answer it honestly. You taught me that the most valuable authentication isn't of paintings, but of love, recognizing what's genuine when it appears, even if it doesn't look like you expected. Especially then." As the evening unfolded, media from around the world captured the event. Antonio's transformation was now public, and Frances found herself being interviewed about her groundbreaking authentication of the real Caravaggio. Sterling, her original blind date from that fateful Christmas, saw the coverage. He had tried to contact her in the past, only to be blocked. He realized what he had dismissed as too intellectual was exactly what she needed, someone who truly valued her for who she was. As the night wore on, Frances stood by Antonio and Veronica, feeling a quiet joy. They were no longer just a family because of necessity or danger. They were a family because they had chosen each other. 6 months had passed since the opening of the Blackshire Legnago Foundation, and life in the Tuscan villa had settled into a rhythm as natural as the sun setting behind the olive groves each evening. Frances sat at her conservation lab, surrounded by the tools of her trade, while Veronica worked at the table nearby, pencil in hand. The gentle hum of the villa, its stone walls holding the warmth of their shared days, became the backdrop to their conversations about art and life. Frances taught Veronica the fundamentals of authentication, how to see a painting not just as an aesthetic object but as a historical document. Veronica's questions were sophisticated, a blend of childlike curiosity and a depth of understanding that would have impressed even the most seasoned scholars. Antonio watched from the doorway, not interrupting, just witnessing. His family, this family, was a reality he'd never imagined, but now he couldn't picture a life without it. Later that week, they took a trip to Venice for foundation business, the canals glistening under a late afternoon sun. As they walked past the Palazzo Contarini del Bovolo, Veronica tugged at Frances's hand, her face thoughtful. "Can we leave flowers there? To remember that scary things became good things." It was a simple request, but in that moment, Frances realized just how far Veronica had come. The trauma had been woven into her story, but it no longer defined her. It had become just one part of the narrative, proof that her family chose her, promises kept. On a video call with Agent Lopez later that day, Frances received a quiet thank you for her role in the restitution efforts. "Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing diverge," Lopez said, "and we have to choose which matters more. You chose the right thing." Frances didn't respond, just smiled, knowing her work had led to something far greater than academic recognition. Veronica's school project was due the next week, and she had created an art installation exploring the concept of found family, families built by choice rather than biology. Her piece included photographs of the three of them, framed by images of empty chairs being filled, broken things being repaired, and light cutting through the darkness. Frances's heart swelled as she gazed at the installation, realizing how much Veronica had internalized what it meant to belong. That evening, as the sky turned gold from the setting sun, Antonio turned to Frances. "I've been contacted by Interpol," he said, his voice steady. "They want me to consult on recovering black market Renaissance works. With my knowledge of the past, I can help in a legitimate capacity." He paused, watching her for her reaction. "Are you okay with that?" Frances looked out over the terrace, the olive trees casting long shadows on the ground. "You're not returning to darkness," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're using your knowledge of it to create light." That's the entire point. The three of them stood in the garden later that evening, Veronica chasing fireflies as the air cooled. Antonio pulled Frances close, his arms around her waist. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice quiet in the gathering dusk. "Choosing this instead of a pristine academic reputation, a conventional family timeline?" Frances thought for a moment, her gaze following Veronica's joyful figure in the distance. "I planned for solitary scholarship and professional respect," she said, her voice steady. "But I found family. I found purpose. I found transformation. That's not compromise. That's finally understanding what matters." Frances had spent her career analyzing Caravaggio's chiaroscuro, the way light emerged dramatically from darkness. But the real lesson wasn't technical, it was philosophical. You couldn't have one without the other. Beauty required struggle. Love required risk. Family required choosing courageously when safer options existed. A year ago, she'd been sitting alone in a Christmas restaurant, convinced she was fundamentally unlovable. Then a little girl in a pink dress had asked 4 words that changed everything. "Can you be my mom?" And Frances had discovered the answer wasn't immediate or easy, but it was absolute. "Yes, if you'll teach me how." What followed was the most valuable authentication of her life, recognizing genuine love when it appeared, even in the most unexpected form. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and be part of a community that cherishes unforgettable tales like this one. Your support means more than you know. It fuels the creation of even more stories that speak to the heart. So, whether you're watching from your TV or your phone, take a moment to join us. Every like, every subscription, every share helps us continue bringing these stories to life. Thank you for being a part of this journey.